New homelessness figures for Scotland will be published on Tuesday. And if recent trends are anything to go by, they are unlikely to bring good news. There is, in the simplest terms, massive demand for housing and far too few houses to go round. We asked the Housing Secretary, Mary McCallan, to come on and talk to us today. She wasn't available. So we thought we'd look beyond politicians and speak to someone who actually runs these things on a practical level. John Mills is head of housing at Fife Council and the co-chair of the Association of People who do his job at other councils. Good morning to you. Thanks for being with us.
Morning, Martin.
Good to see you. Look, we are famously in a housing emergency. That was declared just over a year ago. Is there any sign from your perspective of things getting better?
I think it does vary across the country, Martin. I mean, we've got some authorities who are deep in housing emergency, Edinburgh, Glasgow being amongst them. Certainly where I work in Fife, we've got some green shoots of recovery from the housing emergency, but we've just got to recognise that this is a long road. There's no quick fixes to resolving the housing emergency. I mean, people have been focused on, well, why did we get here? I'm more focused on, well, how can we fix it?
Well, if you don't mind, before we get to that, and clearly that is the essence of this conversation, but let's just labour on how do we get here just a bit, because you mentioned Edinburgh and Glasgow. Both of those cities individually have more children in temporary accommodation in them now than there are in the whole of Wales. How on earth did we get to a situation like that?
I think we've got to go back to pre-COVID times, 2017-18. We had for many years in Scotland a declining homeless population and temporary accommodation that was reducing. And then obviously we got to the pandemic. But even before the pandemic, there were signs of homelessness increasing. I was part of the original Homeless and Rough Sleeping Action Group that the government set up. And our priority in the run-up to COVID was to get people off the streets, get people into accommodation, and then seek about trying to get them permanently and securely housed. And what we've witnessed since the pandemic is a number of headwinds, not least the cost of living crisis, the construction inflation that we've experienced in Scotland, which has been significant. And I think we thought after the COVID pandemic we'd be in a period of recovery and things would get better. They have actually got worse. And I think for a number of reasons, the demand for temporary accommodation has certainly rocketed after the pandemic, and homelessness has continued to increase. People coming from the private rented sector is a significant issue, but the main causes of homelessness in Scotland are still relationship breakdown, so people can't live with relatives, friends, family, or they can't live with their partner anymore, and they are coming to local authorities in increasing numbers. So I think for a number of reasons, take all that together, you get to a point where the housing system is now broken in Scotland. That's what the regulator is saying. And we've got to take a number of actions, significant actions, to fix that.
Right, you are the guy, put very simply, and correct me if this isn't entirely accurate, who sees the pile of applications and sees the amount of stock you have and has to manage the problem that one pile is much bigger than the other pile. What helps you in that? Is it just as simple as more money and more houses?
Well, can I say, first of all, I mean, a number of emails I get from individuals in Fife, tenants and indeed applicants, begging for a chance of a secure council house or a housing association property is increasing. And it's very, very difficult to read those emails. It's tough for staff out there. But that said, the only way that you can actually really make progress in the housing emergency is to actually build at scale, and that's something that the Cabinet Secretary recognises. We also need to buy more houses at scale, and we also need to get down our empty houses both in the public sector and in the private sector, and we're making good progress on that, but there's obviously a lot more to do.
Right, I mean, if the Cabinet Secretary was here, she would be telling me, no doubt, that she has just announced that her government are allocating almost £5 billion over the next 5 years to build 36,000 new affordable homes. But there are a chorus of voices lined up against her saying, that's very good, but it's not enough. In your estimation, is it enough? Will that begin to fix it?
It's a very positive start. I mean, 4.9 billion over the next parliamentary period is a good start. And I think the Cabinet Secretary recognises that. I'm launching a report from the Chartered Institute of Housing, the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations and Shelter next week in Edinburgh that calls for 15,000 affordable houses a year over the next Parliament. And that they reckon that's going to cost 8.2 billion. So what she's announced in 4.9 is a start, but there's obviously a lot more to do.
How do you decide, John, who gets a house? If you've got this overwhelming volume of applications coming to you and you've got to prioritise, how do you do that?
Well, every council in Scotland, every housing association in Scotland has an allocations policy that's approved by the boards of, or the governance board or the members around the committee table. So we try and prioritise people according to the legislation. So we've got to give due preference to homeless people, to people who are severely overcrowded, to people coming out of armed forces, etc., etc. So there is a guideline for officers to make decisions. But clearly, if you're offering people a range of housing options, they're quite narrow at the moment because there isn't enough access to the private rented sector. People are finding it difficult to get on the ownership ladder with the mortgages. So people feel they have no option but to come to the council or a housing association to get access to social housing. So we need to scale up the level of social housing in Scotland to actually make a dent in the demand. But you've got to look at this over a longer period of time. I'm part of the Housing 2040 board working with government in COSLA, and there is a vision for housing in Scotland that takes us to 2040. But you need to have a determination across political parties to actually build at scale to 2040 to really get us back to where we should be in Scotland so that everyone has access to a decent, affordable, warm home.
2040 is a long way off, John. There's hard yards to go between now and then, isn't there?
Yeah, it's tough, but you've got to measure out 5-year political cycles and say, well, what can be achieved there? We've called for a change in Scotland to the housing finance system because a lot of the borrowing for new houses is still, the majority of which comes from tenants' rents, and that's unsustainable because rent levels are increasing. So we've looked at other systems in Europe, and I think they could be applied here in Scotland, but the government needs the Treasury's agreement to do that. But that would make the step change that we're all looking for to get to that 2040 position.
Just briefly, John, and I apologise for throwing this really thorny issue at you right at the end of an interview when we're kind of running out of time. There's a lot of talk of the pressure that asylum seekers or people who have granted leave to remain, refugees, are putting on the system. Just answer this for me, because you're the man who makes the decisions. Do they get priority in cases over homeless people here? Could somebody have been on the housing list in Kirkcaldy for years and then find that they don't get a house when somebody who's just arrived in the country does? Because there's a lot of people looking at that question quite closely just now.
Well, clearly the asylum seekers coming into the UK get accommodated through the Home Office, through MEARS, who are their contractors, and they secure what we would regard as temporary accommodation until the Home Office makes a decision, either positive or negative. Once they have a positive decision, they get leave to remain and they're treated like refugees. So at that point, a person has the opportunity to rent privately, gain access to other types of housing. But if they can't, they have the right to actually claim homelessness. So if they're accepted as homeless, they're treated like every other homeless person in Scotland. They're not given any additional priority.